Good morning to those of you who are in California, and good afternoon to those of you who are on the other side of the pond. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. Justine Rosenthal and I are here to help celebrate Rick Marken's new book. Alas, we can't pass out cigars or chocolates, but we're pleased to give you the opportunity to learn about Rick's book and about its use of perceptual control theory. After receiving a PhD in 1973 for his dissertation on context effects in auditory perception, Dr. Richard Marken pursued various careers that were at least tangentially related to his research. Professor of psychology at a small Midwestern college, human factors engineer at a space systems company, and health policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. His main interest throughout all these pursuits has been the promulgation of an understanding of the nature of purposiveness based on the perceptual control theory model of behavior developed by his mentor, William T. Powers. The results of this interest have been dozens of journal articles, numerous conference presentations, and 5 books dealing with various aspects of PCT. Dr. Marken also has a passion for great literature, another approach to understanding purposiveness. This passion led him and his wife into one of my UCLA extension classes long ago and into the beginning of our close friendship. Rick, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. And welcome to those of you who are here now to the launch webinar for my book, The Study of Living Control Systems. My publisher, Cambridge University Press, usually doesn't do launches like this for academic books, but I managed to talk them into doing it, actually at the behest of Lynn and Justine, because I think this book could be of interest to anyone who wants to understand behavior from a scientific perspective. So it's great to have such a large number of attendees here, many of whom are apparently not family members. This book describes a revolutionary approach to understanding behavior. The approach is based on the observation that you can't tell what a person or other organism is doing by just looking at what it is doing. For example, is the husband who asks a woman for her phone number planning a business meeting or a secret tryst? Is the president who tells an angry crowd to fight speaking metaphorically or inciting insurrection? In both cases, the doings that you can see are the overt actions, the asking for the phone number and the telling the crowd to fight. The doings that you can't see are the purposes of those actions, the business meeting or tryst, metaphor or incitement. Understanding behavior is therefore a matter of understanding its purpose. Actually, most of us, with the possible exception of experimental psychologists, seem to understand this intuitively. For example, when we see people acting strangely and ask ourselves, what are they doing? We are not asking about their actions, which are clearly visible, but about their purposes, which are not. And we are generally able to come up with what we think are satisfactory answers. But these are only guesses. The research methods described in my book, on the other hand, show how we can determine the purposes of behavior scientifically without guesswork and often with mathematical precision. The study of living control systems is an introduction to the research methods that are used to study, the purposeful behavior of living organisms. In other words, it is a book about how to do research on purpose. in both senses. These research methods are based on the perceptual control theory, or PCT, model of behavior, which views purpose as a process of control, which the book will explain what that means. PCT sees organisms as living control systems that act to keep perceptual aspects of their world in goal states. Research on purpose is therefore aimed at determining which perceptual aspects of the world organisms are controlling and how they control them, and why they control them. The book describes how research on purpose is done and how it can be applied to understanding many different aspects of purposeful behavior. For example, I describe research on cognitive aspects of purposeful behavior on the chapter on hierarchical control, how purposeful behaviors are learned, and the kind of behavior that emerges when purposes are carried out in groups. Finally, my book is an homage to the late William T. Powers, who not only developed PCT as a theory, but also showed how to do the kind of research that should be used to test it. Much of Powers' work describing this kind of research is scattered across various journal articles, monographs, and book chapters. My book brings together in one place Powers' work on this topic, as well as that of others who have done this kind of research, organized into textbook sort of form, and presented at a level appropriate, I think, to advanced undergraduates and graduate students, and hopefully accessible to all of you who have been nice enough to come to this launch. And now we will have a little question and answer session led by Justine and Lynn. And I think Justine will start it off.
Yeah, so everyone, thank you for being here today. We are going to give, there's two ways to ask your questions. One is to raise your hand, your virtual hand, and the other is to type a question into that Q&A box you see at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to get to as many of them as possible without too many technical glitches. But I'll start it off, if I may, with something sort of basic. Rick, when you've been talking about, for those of us who are not deeply immersed in this research, when you talk about something like the January 6th events, how would you go about in this research method finding the purpose behind those statements, and how would that differ from the other perhaps more traditional ways or more mainstream ways of examining something like the January 6th events?
Okay, you caught me. That's okay. So from a conventional psychological perspective, I presume, at least from an experimental psychology perspective in the area I was raised in, one would look for what caused that to happen, and what happened. The behavior that was seen would be operationally defined. In other words, it would be the researcher would say what it is what they're trying to study, and so they might operationally define the behavior of the president as incitement. They would already conclude what the behavior was, or they would look to see if they could find variables that would explain what caused that behavior. The control theory approach starts completely differently. It would look for it. First of all, it would look for what was the purpose of that behavior in terms of what was the president trying to achieve. And the way you do that research, it's hard to do it in non-laboratory situations, but basically what you would start off with a hypothesis, like all research, about what he was doing when he said that. What in PCT we call it what perceptual variable was he trying to control? What was the thing he was trying to get to happen? And that's just a fancy way of saying, was he trying to see people go in and invade the Capitol? Was that his purpose in doing that? And so you would start off with that hypothesis, and then you would look for evidence that that was indeed what he was trying to accomplish. And yeah, the press actually, many people figured out the right way to determine whether that was what he wanted. And the way you do it is you look to see if he resists disturbances to that variable. In other words, a disturbance to that variable would have been if they didn't go in and try to take over the Capitol, right?
Or as I think you pointed out to me once, or if he had attempted to stop it.
Exactly. If he had attempted to stop it, that would have been very strong evidence that that was not his goal.
And so a lot of this is really about cause versus purpose.
Exactly.
Distinction.
Right. I guess to understand why I'm so preoccupied with cause versus purpose is because in experimental psychology, in the social sciences in general, the emphasis is on finding what is the cause of particular behavioral events. So behavior itself is there's not a question about what behavior is. Behavior is considered something that pops out of people, like light from a bulb. And the goal of research in experimental psychology is to determine what are the variables that cause certain things to pop out of people at various times. So we have studies of what causes children to be aggressive. So does seeing an aggressive model cause children to be aggressive? So you see studies where one group of kids is exposed to an aggressive model and another group is not. And you find, sure enough, that a larger proportion of kids act aggressively after seeing an aggressive model than a non-aggressive model. And that's a classic psychological experiment. And if you have controlled everything properly, that is, if you've made sure the groups are the same kind of kids, and if you've done it in the same kind of situation and all those other things, then you can conclude that seeing aggressive models cause aggressive behavior. And so, and psychology has been going, research psychology, scientific psychology has been going on that way for 100 years. And they have been doing that because it looks like it works. It looks like you find aggressive models cause behavior. It looks like food reward causes more behavior. It looks, these are all the things we find, and the results of psychological research are reported in that way. Having bad parents causes you to be a criminal and whatever. This is the kind of things that are found. And control theory says those are actually side effects of controlling. Controlling, like if you're controlling for imitating people, if you're a kid and you're controlling for imitating, then if you see a person being aggressive, you will try to be aggressive when you deal with other people and such like that. So that's kind of the problem that we have, is that purposeful behavior where people are trying to create particular results that they want can look like cause effect behavior, and that's So that, but it's not really that way. You can't cause a kid to be aggressive by modeling aggression if they aren't interested in imitating you. In other words,
So in that case, their purpose is imitation.
Right. In that case, the purpose is imitation.
Lynn, do you want to, I don't want to cut you off, Rick, but I want to make sure that we get to questions. Lynn, do you want to pose the next question or call
yes,
on an attendee?
if you don't mind. And what I'm doing is looking at the typed out questions. And one is simply a factual one. For us in the EU, January 6th is unclear. Some of us don't know what happened. So could you, for everyone, explain what was going on in our country and your use of that as an example for what PCT could do?
Oh, well, what happened was that at the time that the presidential election was supposed to be settled by a vote in the count in the Congress that was going to do the, just as a formality, announce the final count or go through the final count. The current president got up in front of a crowd of very angry people who thought that there had been a fraud in the election. And he said, you should go to the Capitol where this is happening and fight for your rights. And in fact, the group went to the Capitol and stormed it, and actually went into the Capitol and got into the Senate chamber and got into the House chamber and started tearing things up. It was an invasion. It was insurrection, and it was kind of scary. It looked to me, it kind of looked like what happens when there's a tidal wave. You know, you see the tide kind of starting to come in, and you know, it looks something's happening here, and then suddenly you see things are breaking down and people are getting hurt and killed, and so that's what happened, and many people blamed it on the speech that the president gave right before this happened. So, and the president claimed that it was not his intention, it was not his purpose to have this happen. And you know, so there was a big question about what he was doing, and that question was, I think, answered pretty well by the fact that he knew this was going on and he did nothing to stop it at all. So that was, and I thought it was an interesting example of a situation where you can't tell what a person is doing by simply looking at what they're doing. And you know, this is a very common thing. Now that I think about it, you know, this is a basic problem in legal things, in the law. I mean, you know, and the law is very much understanding that there is a difference between something that's done on purpose and something that's done accidentally. And that's one of the things that control theory addresses, which is not only about purposeful behavior, it's about the fact that a lot of the things we call behavior are really just side effects of carrying out various purposes. And they're accidental. And you know, lawyers, you know that some things are done accidentally, and the consequences you give people for doing those things are a lot different for things that are done on purpose. especially if they're done premeditated, which means you formulated the purpose in advance and had a whole plan for carrying out the purpose. So a lot of the issue about purposefulness and behavior is kind of unique to psychology, which has scientific psychology, I think, has suffered, especially in the 20th century and still going into the 21st, with what I would call physics envy. And that means that they want to explain behavior in the same way that physicists explain the behavior of a block of wood rolling down an inclined plane, or a ball of wood rolling down an inclined plane. They want to explain behavior in cause-effect terms. And if you take a course in research methods in psychology, which is what I taught as my main thing when I was a professor, and in fact wrote a textbook on it, the main concern in research in psychology is establishing causality, doing your research so that you can properly conclude that one variable was in fact the cause of another variable. So in scientific psychology, the emphasis, the goal has been to find causal explanations of behavior. Of course, you only get statistical causal relations in psychology. So now we've got statistics as a fundamental analysis unit in psychology. But all those statistics are based on a model that says one thing causes another. The statistics are the basis of all statistics is something called the general linear model. And it is a model that says independent variables, X variables, are the cause of Y variables. And you want to find out which X variables cause which Y variables. And
Rick, along those lines, here's another question for a participant. Incidentally, I've been asked how many of us are part of the webinar, and there are currently 64. So
right.
Hello to all of you. But this is a question that says, in a lab or with lots of data, you do something many times to find out a purpose and how it is attained. Is it hard to generalize to a one-time action? So in other words, difference between multiple time action, one-time action.
I don't know of any research where the goal is to do that, but I would, if the question is about generalizing from kind of inverse generalizing, if you've collected aggregate data that you presume reveals some kind of purpose in the group, can you then attribute that to individuals? And I would say no. That's generally bad. I will say this. Psychological data research, because it's statistical, is typically done on groups of people. So you're looking at average results for groups, and that kind of research is really what you're doing is you're studying something about the group itself. You're not studying anything about any individual in the group. And but I think that kind of research is sort of legitimate when you're dealing with questions about policy, because policies apply to groups. So I think the kind of research that's done conventionally in the social sciences is okay, as though it matters what I think, is okay as a way of studying what kind of policies might produce the best results for the group. My interest in PCT is mainly interested in finding what specifically are the kinds of variables, purposes that people carry out. I think I have to be specific about this. Purposes in PCT, a purpose is an intended state of a perceptual variable. And so when we're trying to find out what a person's purpose is in control theory terms, we're trying to find what perceptual variable the person is controlling. Now, we control lots of perceptual variables all at the same time. So we are controlling, the angles of our limbs are variables that we control. We control our posture, but we also control our relationship to other people and the nature of our relationship. Some of the variables we control are quite complex, obviously. We control, our distance from other people, but we also control the nature of our relationship, whether it's a marriage relationship or a friendship relationship. We control all these things by acting in ways that we think preserve our perception of ourselves being in those, having those variables in what the state we want them to be in. And so the goal of PCT is just so different than the goal of research on purpose, is very different than the goal of conventional research. It really requires a whole different way of thinking about doing research. What we want to find out is what are specifically the kinds of variables you control. And so far, what research has been done, and this is a pretty thin book, so there hasn't been a lot of it, but most of the research that's been done has been on control of very simple variables. The one, my particular, I think I mentioned this, my particular area where I've tried to demonstrate the kind of research you would do has been in how you intercept moving objects. How do people, catch fly balls or intercept a moving object of some kind. The fellow I worked with was having people intercept frisbees or moving helicopters that moved in funny ways. And what we found was that people control for these visual variables. They try to keep the object that's being pursued, they kind of try to keep it stationary, visually stationary, vertically and horizontally. They try to keep it, so they move so that it's not, so the image isn't changing. And if you do that, if you move so as to keep the object stationary, you'll get yourself under it. And then you have all other things you have to do to actually catch it, but still it gets you to the object. So we've discovered that what you're controlling is vertical optical velocity and horizontal displacement. Those are the variables. There were alternatives. There were other possibilities. It could have been vertical acceleration. It could have been linear movement of the object on your eye. So we did some research and we found that that's actually the best definition. So that was an example of the kind of thing you would do if you were doing this kind of research based on perceptual control theory. You would try to find them.
I want to shift gears a little bit. I'm sure we'll come back to some of these mechanics, but I know we have a number of people in the audience who also are wondering about its effects on psychiatry. And there's one of the questions here, is if you could comment on what you feel the implications are or may be for researching and treating mental illness.
There's a lot of people out there, they're probably among them that are out there, who are using conceptually the PCT model as a basis for psychiatry. The reason for that is because PCT has a lot to say about how you end up with psychiatric problems, mainly a result of control systems coming into conflict with each other, and trying to get the same. You get into conflict with yourself when you try to get the same variable into two different states, and which is physically impossible. So you want to have your cake and eat it too, which is possible, but still. And there's also part of the theory is how you learn, in a sense, to revise your goals in order to get rid of those conflicts, because that's the light bulb that has to be changed. You have to change the way you want things. So psychiatrists and clinical psychologists have seen the relevance of PCT to what they're doing, and they have had apparently a lot of success with that. I think that eventually, from my perspective, I'm a researcher, and so I'm barely able to help myself, let alone pay people. But I think my dream would be that that the research we do on perceptual control theory, the scientific side of it, would contribute to improvements in psychiatric care in the same way that science, physics, and chemistry have improved engineering applications, the applied side of that stuff. And I think one big way that would happen, possibly, is at the end of this book, I describe a research program that Powers thought would be good. And that would be a program where you would basically have a catalog, kind of like a database of the kinds of variables that human beings control. And organized in a way he thought that there would be types of variables, only a limited type of variables, like limited types of animals in the animal kingdom. But there would be different kinds of instances of each of those types. Like we control program type variables, and we control principles, and so there's different kinds of principles that we control, and things like that. And I think that kind of a database could become the basis for a new psychiatry that would replace the DSM-7 or wherever they are now. Instead of having this list of things that people do that you find annoying or troubling, you would have a list of the kinds of things people control, and see if you can see whether the person you're dealing with might be having conflicts at these particular levels. The theory says that the different kinds of variables are controlled at different levels in your nervous system. And so if you could, as a practitioner, actually have some way of diagnosing people in terms of their purposes, instead of in terms of their overt behavior, you might get a more effective or efficient psychiatry. So I don't know if that helps.
Fascinating. Another question from the audience. Can you differentiate the purposeful behavior models of cause and effect among humans versus animals? Any fundamental differences?
No, that's a great question. I think there's been some really nice research done with animals, some of which I name in the book, or report in the book, but I'm a pretty confirmed evolutionist, which reminds me, I wanted to say, evolution. I think PCT is to psychology in a way that evolutionary theory was to biology. It's kind of a whole new way of organizing this stuff. But the problem is Darwin had Huxley and Powers has me, so but I'm trying my best. But no, I think the animal research is animals all life should be organized in this way. And it's according to control theory, in a way, the difference between a rock and even a virus, the simplest thing is that the virus has a purpose. It wants to latch up with some stuff that when it does it, it screws you up, but it's different than that. So all life is, or it's this closed loop organization, a particular kind called negative feedback closed loop, which results in an organization of physical components where there's still causality, by the way. We're not going into mysticism here. The components of a control loop all are causally related. But when they're related in this negative feedback relationship, suddenly you get this new thing where the organization, the structure of these physical components behaves purposefully in the sense that it produces an intended result. It produces a result that it protects from disturbance, that it makes it happen. It makes that happen. So yeah, I think a fascinating way of going about this would be to look at the relationship between other species or other organisms and people and see any differences in what they control.
Well,
I think there would be few. Yeah.
I think this sort of follows on in a certain way, which is when you conceptualize purposeful behavior, sort of how do you define it and operationalize it, and sort of what role does awareness and consciousness play here, particularly when we are then talking about things like viruses versus human behavior or evolution?
Great question. Okay, so one of the nice things about control theory is it distinguishes between purposeful behavior and consciousness. And consciousness is definitely part of the control of the PCT model because we know it's there. But a lot of talk on consciousness is confused because consciousness and purpose are often conflated in ways that I think are different. But in control theory, consciousness is separate from consciousness is a purposeful thing, but consciousness is the thing that helps, that changes, that learns, that helps control systems learn how to work better. We don't know much about consciousness. All we know is that it's there. And we know that it's obviously separate from purpose, because we are carrying out all kinds of purposes, as I said, simple purposes like moving our arms, maintaining our posture. We're doing those things without being conscious of them. Consciousness is not necessarily involved in purposeful behavior, skillful behavior. In fact, I think that's what Zen is about. I think once you've developed, you're able to do things skillfully, once you start trying to become conscious of how you do it, boom, it falls apart. And I think part of what Zen is about is trying to get you out of that. Yet once you are controlling successfully, consciousness should kind of go away from it. But what consciousness is and how it works, we don't know, but there could be some research on it. That would be actual research that could be done. Oh, and consciousness is a fundamental component of the psychiatric application, clinical application. I mean, you know, they know this. I mean, consciousness is involved in solving your problems.
Perfect.
That's for sure. So.
Another question. Control engineering has matured and proliferated since Powers' work. Do you think recent developments have any more relevance to your area of study?
Great question. The fact is that Powers is not did not bring control theory to psychology. In fact, control theory, probably the formal control theory, which is just, you know, comes out of electronic engineering and all that, control theory, which is really not even a theory, it's a bad name for it. Control theory is actually an engineering model. It's not a theory, it's a description of how control systems work mathematically. But anyway, that was applied in psychology back in, I think the first paper was published in might have been during the Second World War, but the published papers were like in 46, 47, where they applied control theory to aviation and human factors engineering, my discipline, because they would see how well people could control the attitude of an airplane and stuff like that using a control stick and stuff. The innovation that Powers came up with was, well, let me just say that when control theory was applied, it was also applied in cybernetics, sort of. Norbert Weiner came in the 50s, and he knew that control systems were purposeful systems. There was a lot of talk about purpose, but they never quite got it right. And the reason they didn't quite get it right is they kept listening to the psychologists talking about how people work. And it was all kind of in terms of causality, input-output causality, stimulus response kind of stuff. So the control theory in the 40s and 50s, and to this day, it was applied in the context of a stimulus response model, which you can do. You can apply the theory that way. What Powers did was he realized that behavior, what you're seeing when you're seeing people behave is controlling. You're seeing people control. He was able to see this because he was trained as a physicist. And so he knew that when you see people like walking, they're not just emitting steps. They are having to carefully vary our muscle tensions to compensate for, changes in the height of the ground, slight changes, even little changes, tiny change, anything, because you cannot just output the right neural signals to send over and over again to your legs and end up walking. A roboticist probably figured this out in the first 2 minutes when they try to build robots that walked. If you try to just have its legs move in a particular way. So the point is that what you're seeing when you see behavior, anything that you call behavior, is a controlled process. It's the production of a consistent result in the context of often invisible disturbances that you can't see. You can't really see easily the disturbances that are acting when you're just walking. And so the powers knew this, and so he asked himself, so that right there is, then that needs an explanation. How do you explain the fact that we can do this stuff? That we can maintain a marriage as long as we can. Anything that we do that is reasonably consistent, how do we do that? And we do it because we can perceive the state of that variable. A marriage is a pretty complex perception, but it is a perception, and very complex perception. But it's something that we can perceive, and we can perceive the state of it. We can perceive how it's going. And we can act as necessary, if we're reasonably skillful at it, to keep things on track reasonably well. We are controlling when we are doing these things, and we're failing to control when we're not. And
well, I think this question follows on this. Rick, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
that's
off
great.
there.
I'm sorry.
Someone who's very much enjoying the book is wondering why you think there has been so much resistance or ambivalence to Powers' ideas among psychologists and behavioral scientists. Again, I'm adding, considering the argument you're making, and whether or not that might be changing.
I've been doing this for 40 years. I think I know why it's true, and I've given up trying to make it different, which is why I wrote this book. I just wrote it to say there's very little argument in this book. I do spend a little time saying why this is the appropriate thing to do, but I wrote it as my last thing I do before I cut out. No. To just show what to get started, to show what I think should be the new way you do psychology. Why the resistance? It's simple, but if you tell people who are resisting or who are not inclined to do it why they're resisting, they're going to get pissed. But the fact is they're resisting because careers are on the line. People are in academia and they get tenure or not because of their success at doing certain programs. So career, the reality of having a career, the reality of the infrastructure that exists now, that's huge. There are, there's an industry, of course, that supports the conventional way of going about these things. And people are more comfortable with it. And so a lot of people, because they're comfortable with it, because their careers depend on it, because they're of all these various things that are real life things. These are not made up things, just intellectual things. These are people's lives that are involved. I think some people have been able to convince themselves that there's really nothing new here, who cares? And so they're comfortable carrying on. And some people are a little more truculent about it and say, you're the stupidest person that ever lived, and you call it, yes, but there has been resistance. And So I guess my only hope, there are several, there's people who are doing this, but my only hope, and I guess the real reason I wrote this book, which is that I hope that there might be, if it's used in a research methods course as an adjunct text, or if it's used in a graduate early seminar, I might be able to get someone interested in doing it. And there might be, so there have been a couple people who have managed to come through it. But it's difficult. It's just difficult. And I understand. So we shall see.
And Rick, that sort of follows on what you just said. Here's a question. Rick, why should a researcher who is already knowledgeable about perceptual control theory buy and read your book? Buy, perhaps most importantly. Is it a useful operating manual to doing research on purposeful behavior? Are there new methods and tips included for PCT research?
God, you guys are great. I never asked myself that. I would say that there is very little new that a person who is familiar with perceptual control theory and is actually there, whatever that means, who's a scientific researcher who's willing to do this stuff. There's not much new for them. I really did it for the reason I said, and that's why Cambridge published it, because that's what I put in the perspective. This is really an attempt to gather together what I think, the best stuff from Powers, where he actually discusses methodology, because most of the discussion, most of what goes on with PCT is theoretical. There's just tons of, and a lot of the stuff that goes on with PCT troubles me in a way, because it treats the theory as though it's a fait accompli, like it's been written on tablets and delivered down. And that troubles me. Because I know it's well-intentioned. So I'm hoping that some people who are like the idea of PCT would read this just to see PCT from the perspective that I came to it from which I came to it. I came to it as a fallen PhD psychologist who got entrenched, got involved in this stuff. But to me, it was all about the science, about really doing a scientific approach, and not renewing the scientific approach to psychology. Which, by the way, was actually kind of starting, if you're just talking about it in terms of purpose rather than more technical terms like controlled variables and things like that, this, I quote William James in here. William James knew the difference between purposeful and non-purposeful behavior. I've read some incredible, wonderful naturalistic biology books where they're completely comfortable about talking about animal behavior in terms of it being purposeful. I think this was maybe before John B. Watson in 1913. Everything changed. It went over to be purely scientific. So that's it. Yeah, I think it is worth it for people who are familiar with PCT to read the book. They might be familiar with a lot of it, but I don't think it's ever been put together all in one place, just almost purely methodological. It's very methodologically oriented rather than.
Rick, as we're wrapping up here, sort of if there was one big takeaway you were hoping that people would get out of this, besides to go please buy the book when we're done. Closing thoughts, closing aspirations and ambitions for this and for the work in general.
My aspirations are I would love it if people at least gave the book a try, who are whether they're in academia or not, whether they've been involved in PCT or not. I would like them to give it a try just to see my perspective on PCT as a science, which means it's not just a theory, but it's a theory that is based in observation and test, and I shouldn't say just a theory, by the way. I like theory. I think it's the most important thing, but so that's it. And it would be great if something like some small number or even large number of younger people who are starting off in their careers would give this a try. And not just younger people, or older people too, who are smarter than me. I wrote this admitting I need help. Not many people have been doing this. Bill Powers himself was not completely transparent about how you do things. He developed a lot of wonderful little computer-based experiments, which and demonstrations that were just brilliant. And I copied those, and then I went on, and it turns out I'm kind of an idiot savant on developing those kinds of things. So that's why I got into this. I went a little bit beyond Bill's stuff, but doing that kind of little Galileo type experiments, balls rolling down planes kind of things. And I just had a talent for doing that, but that's as far as it went. So, but I know that there is a bigger picture here. There's that can be done productively. So that's it. I'm hoping for the future of this work. And I think it can make mankind better. I think it can improve the world. I don't know exactly how, but I know it can. And there have been applications of this to make the world better. I think how much time do I got?
I'm going to wrap up by thanking everyone for coming. I have to say it's been a pleasure for me to prepare for this with Rick and Lynn and everyone at Cambridge. We hope you will all buy the book and have a wonderful either rest of the day or evening, depending on where you're located in the world right now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.